Our next panel focuses on workforce housing access and social outcomes. As cities grow and economies evolve, access to housing and workforce opportunities has become one of the defining challenges of urban sustainability. Real estate plays a central role in shaping who can live, work, and thrive in our cities, and how policy, education, and development decisions translate into real social outcomes. This panel brings together leaders from higher education, housing policy, research, and community development to explore how the built environment can better support equitable access and long-term opportunity.
When we talk about housing affordability in New York, there isn't a single definition or lived experience. Different New Yorkers face very different realities, and today's conversation reflects that range of perspectives. With that in mind, I want to start by asking one guiding question to all the panelists. Looking ahead, what changes, whether in policy design or implementation, would most meaningfully improve access, equity, and opportunity in housing?
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here and to have this conversation with my fellow panelists. I think, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. I wish I could tell you that there's one thing that we need to do, but there's a lot that we need to do, and I would put the kind of policies and process improvements that we need to adopt in sort of 5 different buckets. One is that we need to build more housing. We need to build that housing more quickly, and we need to build that housing more cheaply, and we need to build that housing in a wide variety of neighborhoods across the city, not just the same neighborhoods which is where we continue to build housing. And if you look at a map of where housing has been built over the last decade, there are many neighborhoods where there's been zero housing built. We also need to build in this sort of a variety of different types of housing to accommodate the diversity of different household arrangements in the city. And that includes, for instance, single-room occupancy apartments and accessory dwelling units, and we can talk more about those details. The second thing the second category I would add is that we can't just focus on new production. People like new production; it's kind of exciting, but the reality is that housing is durable and it needs reinvestment. And New York City has one of the oldest housing stocks in the country, and housing needs reinvestment. Most importantly, we need to reinvest in our critical stock of public housing, which I'm happy to talk more about later, but latest estimates are that the public housing stock faces a capital need of $80 billion. No, I didn't say that wrong, right? $80 billion. And so, just sort of public housing has suffered from long-standing neglect in New York City and across the country. Third, in addition to sort of, improving the condition of and affordability of existing housing, I think we also need to think about creative ways to use our existing stock more effectively. And, we can't, I do believe we need to build more housing, but we can't, that's gonna take time, and we have a crisis today. And so I think thinking about ways to move people into the available homes more quickly, and also figure out ways that we can, encourage sharing of housing, encourage more people to move into housing, and scrutinize our housing codes and our laws, occupancy codes, about how many people can live in homes. The fourth category, I'd say, is sort of improving access to and affordability of housing. And there are many New Yorkers whose incomes just can't even support the operating costs of housing in New York, and those households need subsidies, and they also need ways to facilitate their entry into housing. And finally, we need to protect against displacement and poor housing conditions. New York City has one of the most stringent sort of set of tenant protections in the country, but there are still many vulnerable households in the city and vulnerable renters who face poor conditions and are vulnerable to displacement, not just from rising rents, but also from climate change. So I'll stop there for now. That was a big category, but hopefully useful framing.
You didn't get to all 5.
I did get to 5. Yeah, no, I did get to 5, right? Build more housing quickly and cheaply everywhere in different types. Second, we need to renovate and invest in preserving the existing stock. Third, we need to use the existing stock more sort of effectively and efficiently. We need to improve access to affordable housing. That's 4. And 5 is to protect against poor housing conditions and displacement. Okay, there you go. All 5.
I'm happy to jump in. Is this working? Can you hear me? Great. All of these are great ideas. I work for the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, right? We do these things. We preserve affordable housing, less so public housing, although we're involved in that as well. We build new housing, right? We could do way more of that if there was more money, right? So that's a major issue, right? There's funding needed for the housing itself, for the projects, for the staffing, the agencies, and all of that. And that bucket often is shrinking when we need it to grow. But the other thing that we can do, right, are things that don't actually require money but save money. And that's a really important thing to layer into this. How can we build like what we're already doing more cost effectively and more quickly? Like time is money, we all know this, but as an agency and a government person, right, there's always this pressure to get more done quickly, and it's really, really hard to do. I mean, I think folks in the room who work on affordable housing or even market rate housing, it's really hard to get a project across the finish line. So this new administration is trying to focus again, and happens in every new administration, on speeding things up. There's an initiative called SPEED, in fact, right? And it's really important that we figure out how to streamline the processes of everything, and not just at the housing agencies, but the Department of Buildings and DEP and all the agencies. We need to figure out how to get things done, or else we're going to constantly just build a pipeline that can't get built. And I think that's really important. It's also really, really hard. And the other thing I'll say, and this comes up again every 4 years, or depending on how often we have a new administration, how do we innovate our way around this stuff, right? We're not really being effective all the time doing the same thing over and over. City of Yes was a major innovation in housing, allowing more housing to get built. But zoning bonuses are another way to creatively, incentivize housing without having to add money in all cases. So we just always need to be thinking about not just the problems, but what are the new ideas to get them done.
Hi, everyone. Ooh, now this sounds too loud. Trying to wake you up after the lunch sleepiness. So remember her 5 things? That's going to be the quiz. My name is Daphany Sanchez, and I am coming from the perspective of a program implementer, but also a born and raised New Yorker. And so I was someone that was raised in public housing. A lot of my family and friends lived in Section 8 and Section 202 housing, which is like special services housing. So our perspective at KC3 is really thinking about program implementation from the perspective of the New Yorker that's living in these properties. I think often when affordable housing is designed and programs are deployed, we make 101 loops to prove that someone is actually low income, and having to create all of these systems and all of these barriers makes it actually 10 times harder for a low income person to live in affordable housing and continue to exist in affordable housing than a market rate building. So when you ask what does the future look like, we're always thinking about, one, how do we ensure affordability without displacement? So when we're talking about climate solutions like clean technology, energy efficiency, decarbonization, ensuring that the cost does not weather on to the tenants. And 2, how do we ensure that this is not creating an additional burden or an undue harm on the tenant? So yes, we create a program that on paper and the theory all makes sense and it all adds up, but then we're asking someone that is overburdened because they're living paycheck to paycheck to do these 10 other steps and go to these 3 other agencies in order to get an apartment, which is incredibly difficult, right? You're putting a person at the opportunity that in a tight spot where they may lose their job, or they may have issues with childcare, or they may have other issues that we're not, again, thinking about because they're not top of mind for everyone. So program implementation is very, very important to us in understanding like the goal of designing everything from the perspective of the individual and the recipient that's getting the services is critical for affordable housing, and especially as we're decarbonizing and retrofitting our city.
My turn, I guess. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, there we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Kenneth Adams. I'm the president of LaGuardia Community College in CUNY over in Long Island City. And you're like, why is he here? Like, he's not a developer. He don't work at HPD. He's not the Furman Center. So first, I guess, I'll give you a LaGuardia very parochial perspective, and then a couple of comments in an attempt to answer Levi's question. I'm really here because Levi invited me. Right? You can't say no to this guy, so we're all here. But seriously, so CUNY has about almost 250,000 students, roughly 250,000 students. And according to a study done in 2019 by some researchers at Rutgers, over half of our students suffer from housing insecurity, about 55%, and that plays out in different ways. But importantly, something like 14% of those students are homeless. That's 35,000 CUNY students who are trying to go to class every day, a good number of them at LaGuardia. And so that's how I got drawn into this issue of, well, my parochial issue would be solutions, housing solutions for low-income CUNY students who suffer from housing insecurity, and that housing insecurity becomes an obstacle to their academic success and to their earning their degrees and their credentials that they need for stable living wage employment. If you think about, if 14% of 250,000 students is 35,000 students, NYU has about 30,000 undergraduate students. So imagine every NYU student being a homeless person. It's kind of hard to fathom. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem for CUNY. So I'm one of the 26 CUNY presidents or deans, lobbying the CUNY Central Administration and ultimately our trustees. And I don't mind saying this public, but I think CUNY ought to get back into the housing business, because we have a problem at scale for our students. And apart from the sort of moral failure of not taking up that responsibility, that would just be another group of New Yorkers in the housing crunch under which the whole city suffers. So that's a little bit about why I'm so interested in this topic. And I will say, so far, all we've been able to do at LaGuardia are kind of short-term patches for students really in a jam. When it gets very, very cold and students are sleeping in their cars, we have an arrangement, very generous arrangement with Airbnb, and Airbnb gives us a voucher allocations, and we find modest Queens households that are hosts, and the students go into Airbnbs, and we enable them to do that thanks to Airbnb to the end of the semester or until graduation, because we don't want to disrupt their progress as students by having them become homeless again. But again, that's not sustainable. I mean, Airbnb is very generous, but they can't do that for 35,000 students across the system. And so the solutions we're talking about this afternoon are that's the lens, if you will, or the reason that they mean a lot to me. The other thing I'll point out that's not really consequential, but it's why I also have some feelings about some of these issues, that for about 7 years I chaired all of the state affordable housing agencies boards. There's an alphabet soup under Ruth Ann Wisnauskas at DHCR and HCR of Sunny May and a whole host of other agencies that do housing finance and development around the state. And I chaired those boards for Governor Cuomo and Governor Hochul for 7 years. And so I was able to observe a lot of this in our monthly meetings in terms of the attempts to provide incentives to developers to build affordable housing. None of which, by the way, was directed to help CUNY students. That's another thing I got excited about. But anyway, that's also what I bring to the discussion. So thanks.
So I'm going to go back to you, Kenneth, since just talking. You talked about some of the issues.
I can do that. That's no problem.
You talked about some of the issues that the students are facing and some of the solutions. What can't the institutions realistically solve when it comes to housing, and where do partnerships matter the most?
Well, I'll cite another partnership, Levi, that has been terrific. There's a wonderful organization called Neighborhood Coalition for Shelter. It actually started out in the 1980s running soup kitchens and providing housing solutions on the Upper East Side, a coalition of churches and synagogues and mosques, run till recently by a woman named Ann Shaloff. And Ann got financing from Trinity Wall Street got a very sizable grant to provide a housing solution, which again is not going to endure because the money runs out. I found a building in Long Island City, did a sublease for something like 20 apartments. It's an interesting sort of building. The way it was designed, it wasn't really working as a sort of a market rate development in that location. So we've been able, Medgar Evers primarily, but also LaGuardia has been able to have students living in these kind of shared apartments. And what it suggests is, and it's something Ellen brought up, is to be innovative or creative around the design. So these apartments would have almost like a suite, which you might have here at NYU dorms, I don't know, but where the student would have a bedroom, but there'd be a shared kitchen and common dining area and a shared bathroom. Kind of like a suite, right? And the idea is, and then there's supportive services, library, gym, actually social services and things down in the building on the main floor. But it was a super kind of creative and almost spontaneous, and again, didn't last forever because the grant didn't last forever. But it had this flexibility that really, really worked for students. And so we're actually speaking at LaGuardia now to a developer in Long Island City about something like that down the road. But I would note that, as a state policy matter, if you look at categories for supportive housing under ESHI, the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, there is no ESHI category for low-income CUNY or SUNY student, or homeless college student for that matter, as there might be for disabled veterans or mentally ill or formerly incarcerated. In other words, certain categories for which developers can get incentives. So number one, you can hear me lobbying for something for our students. Maybe that's a little parochial too. But then I also think they're just opportunities for, and these are solutions for everybody, not just for our students, where we do need more density. We do need, I'll say one thing and then shut up. But in New York City, outside of Manhattan, 92, the buildings next to 92% of subway stations are 2 to 3 stories tall. Outside of Manhattan, the buildings adjacent to subway stations, you can count them and put them on a map, you could look it up on your phone, are 2 to max 3 stories tall. And we talk about transit-oriented development, but we don't really have it here, right? We think it's great on Long Island when they do it in, Hicksville. I'll come back to this if there's time, but I think there are things that we need to rethink around location, around density, to support where I think Ellen was going with one of her comments. When I was with the state, every month we allocated scarce taxpayer resources for the development of housing in 2 communities, Brownsville and East New York. Why? Because it's where the land was the cheapest. And obviously, land costs really matter. So then what we end up doing, talk about the Fair Housing Act, we actually violate we actually concentrate poverty in neighborhoods where the land is cheap, because developers get their incentives, people want affordable housing, advocates want housing, the push comes to shove, you have to find land. Land is cheaper in Brownsville than it is on the Upper East Side, last time I checked. And so we concentrate all of talk about social pathologies and social conditions in certain neighborhoods, almost by design.
Ingrid, I'd love to move back. Thank you for the institutional perspective, Kenneth. Talking about, from your perspective as a researcher in the field of urban policy and housing, can you talk a bit about which of your proposed ideas you feel are most urgent, 1, and 2, achievable?
Yeah, okay, so that's a big question. And I think, unfortunately, what's the most urgent isn't always the most achievable, but we don't have a choice, right? We really have to figure this out. I will build off of Ken and saying, I don't know if I can give one idea. So let me try 3, more specific than what I talked about before. I think on building new housing, we absolutely need targeted neighborhood level rezonings, and we need to upzone near transit. I completely agree. There is a lot of room for new housing in the city's lower density neighborhoods, the neighborhoods where there has been no housing built in decades. And this really is, to be clear, we're not talking about building like 30-story buildings. This is about sort of a gentle, what I would call a gentle density, okay? This is about duplexes and triplexes and accessory dwelling units and small apartments near transit that might be over retail stores, right? These wouldn't fundamentally change the look and the feel of neighborhoods. I think related to that also, there's a lot of city-owned land. There's also a lot of faith-based land. There's a lot of other nonprofits that own land, and I think we need to work to make that land easier to develop for affordable housing. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd say. Second, again, I think the city could do a lot more to preserve the existing stock of housing. And here again, I would emphasize the city's sort of critical, really essential stock of public housing, right, which Daphany also mentioned. And I think, I think, Daphany, you were going to disagree with me a little bit, but I do think that that I would support NYCHA's efforts to experiment with a variety of different approaches to to work with residents and get their input, but to preserve the stock of public housing through creative ways. And sometimes that means bringing in a private sector partner. We have done research on what's called RAD, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, and we've shown that both in New York City and across New York State, that those conversions have not led to elevated evictions. And actually we've just expanded that to across the country. That's not to say that there aren't individual developments, right, where there may be owners who are not acting as responsibly. But I think given the dilapidated conditions of so many NYCHA buildings, and given the antipathy of not just this Congress, but the history of Congresses in the United States towards public housing, I just don't think there is an alternative. I don't think we can kind of wait. I just don't think the alternatives are tenable. And finally, I think, and here I'll build off of both Jennifer and Daphany and really talk about, I think that we need to pay more attention to access to housing. And a lot of this is about sort of the process improvements. A lot of this is about thinking from the perspective of the people who are moving into that housing and receiving subsidies. Talk about administrative burden. I mean, Daphany, you mentioned, I was just looking at some numbers. I think that it took like 192 days, the median time okay, this is after an affordable unit was completed. It took like 192 days, median, to have somebody move in, to be approved to move in to that. Okay, let me just, I know you're all good at math, but 192 days, right? This is like 6 months. So we're counting that unit as having been completed, but it takes 6 months for somebody to move in. Okay, I've been doing a lot of work on the Housing Choice Voucher Program also. It just makes you want to pull your hair out. That we find that over 40% of households in New York City that receive a Housing Choice Voucher, and this is after waiting for years and years and years to receive that voucher, they have to give that voucher back to NYCHA because they are not able to use that voucher they cannot find a home that they can rent with that voucher. And so I think it's sort of not enough. This is sort of, we need to fix these things, right? It's not enough for me to sit here, and this is sort of what I do, right? Like my work, I like design, think about new housing policy solutions, but it's not enough. And this is, I think your focus on implementation is absolutely essential because it's not enough to just sort of design these new programs. We really have to work to make sure that they actually work for the people that are going to use them.
Thank you, and I think that's a great transition to Daphany. I have a question for you. Can you talk a little bit about the work you do with your clients and some of the most important areas of focus in order to achieve the greatest sustainable impact?
Sure. So I think when we're talking about affordable housing, it's very easy to think about like the built structures that exist in New York City, which is the buildings, right? That's the kind of most direct route. I think one thing that's also important to understand is just the historical context of this investment. It's not like an overnight disinvestment, right? Because of structurally racist policies, a lot of these buildings do not have the funding that they need in order to operate, whether these are co-ops, low-income buildings, Section 8 buildings, et cetera. Like, they have fundamentally been disinvested in, and they're concentrated in areas where they traditionally are rejected for loan and financing opportunities. And so that that still exists in the sustainability space. Our work is really concentrated in understanding the ecosystem that is around these affordable housing properties, ensuring that they have the tools and the resources that they need in order to help specific decision makers make a conscious decision on what upgrades need to happen, what's the pathway for those upgrades, what are the opportunities that they can pursue, who are the contractors out there, without having an undue financial consequence. So I'll give a couple of examples. One is in the 1 to 4 family space. So in New York City, the 1 to 4 family sector, is about 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And we struggle with doing any type of energy efficiency work because the amount of funding is just so limited. 1 to 4 family sector also has less regulatory agreements and less kind of oversight for tenants, just because the city does a lot of multifamily housing. And so what's happened over the past 10 to 15 years is that there's been a lot of for-profit developers, large private equity firms and hedge funds that have purchased a bunch of 1 to 4 family homes, which is again accelerating that housing inequality, accelerating the cost of living in New York City to the point of people just can't afford to be here. So one of the things that we understand is that, again, when government fails, when private companies fail, there's always a series of nonprofits that are in the community providing support in areas that are not supported. So there's something called, from the Fair Housing Act, HUD counseling agencies. And these are basically nonprofits across the country that are specifically designed to help low-income New Yorkers, working New Yorkers, or working folks to understand, how do you purchase a home, what are the repairs that your home needs, how do you avoid foreclosure prevention. And so they're working all the elements of housing, but they're not necessarily equipped with the energy efficiency or decarbonization conversation. So what we do here at KC3 is that we provide them with the tools necessary so that their staff, first and foremost, has the information and the financial tools in order to go and integrate this into their existing products. So we work closely with a nonprofit called Neighborhood Housing Services of Queens, and they came to us because they had a homeowner that received a predatory solar loan, and they were overwhelmed to the point that they were going to foreclose. So we sat down with the homeowner, who was monolingual. We found out that the solar vendor just gave them an English contract, told them to sign and don't worry about it. They never connected. They never did the interconnection for the solar panels. They never submitted the permits for Department of Buildings. So we basically worked with them to fix all of those issues and then explain to them, hey, here's your pathways. You can do a lease, you can do a power purchasing agreement, or you can own it. And once we were able to give them that information, they felt comfortable in kind of navigating what's the pathway forward, and did some consumer protections work. And what we did with the nonprofit after giving us that information is that we secured funding for them so that they can teach their staff, have the operational element as well, because often when people engage in nonprofits, there's just an expectation of, like, you need to go and do this work, but not giving them any of the resources that they need in order to be able to do that on the administration side. So we got them the funding, and now they've been working across of Queens, and we have another nonprofit in Staten Island doing comprehensive energy efficiency. So not only solar, but also heat pumps, building weatherization, appliances and plugins, and doing it from that holistic perspective when somebody's buying a home. So that's the 1 to 4 family side. On the multifamily side, we actually work really closely with Jen and her team, is ensuring that as we're thinking about things like Local Law 97, decarbonization, Local Law 87, looking at energy audits and benchmarking, that people actually understand what the work is, and what do they have to do, and what are the financing options, and what does it mean to them to take on an additional loan. A lot of the properties that we work with, they get rejected because they don't have the right debt to income ratio that the traditional lenders are looking for. And so we Frankenstein funding opportunities, whether it's grants, subsidies, discretionary funding from city council, in order to make it work so that they don't have to increase, or obviously like HPD subsidy and HCR subsidy, so that they don't have to increase the rent on the tenant. Because again, we don't want sustainability for the sake of sustainability. We always have to come from the perspective of the tenant and work backwards. And that's really critical for us. at KC3, and so we've been doing this for 9 years now, ensuring that multifamily residents and tenants in 1 to 4 family homes are able to continue living without the stress of an unhealthy home or high bills.
Thank you. And now to move to Jennifer. I would love, you touched on it briefly, but I'd love to ask you more about your role at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the impact on the actual communities in New York City and the people. Could you speak on that a little bit?
Sure. All right, that's, take yours. All right, that's way better. That actually works. So I focus really only on sustainability and climate-related issues. My role at HPD sits in our Office of Policy and Strategy. Sustainability is connected to policy and connected to development, right? So I'm part of the development process. We make sure the buildings that we build have standards that are healthy and safe and climate forward, let's say, for everything we build. We engage in city policy, incoming and outgoing. So if somebody has a big idea, we represent affordable housing and climate on those topics. And then we do a lot of background stuff to make sure that as people build, there are things like underwriting standards for affordable housing to make sure, to the best of our ability, that projects who do the shiny, golden sustainability thing can actually sustain themselves in terms of cash flow, utility costs, and so on. So a lot of non-sexy stuff and sexy stuff, and so on. One of the things we try to do at HPD, and as Daphany said, we work closely together, is to make sure that we're not only, at least in terms of climate, only focusing on the shiny, new, big idea, right? It would be super cool if we said every time, best in class everything has to be the perfect version of sustainability. And this happens a lot, and I'm touching a little bit on what Daphny's talking about. If we do that, and a lot of programs do this, they pick that big idea and everybody's got to do it. You got to put a heat pump in every building. You got to do this, you got to do that. Not thinking of the holistic and possibly detrimental impacts of only going after the big next thing. Our goal with everything we're doing, this is where we hope we're having the best community impact, is trying to balance all of the important pieces of the housing we build, right? Stability, affordability, meeting the climate objectives, but not doing anything that's actually going to be negative in that. And for us, we think, my team, I like to think, we try and think of sustainability as really like about longevity and durability and all the things, and not just the one big idea at the time. And it's really, really important, and it's something hopefully everybody in this room thinks about, like, as they're doing this in the future. If you get stuck on the one big thing and at the expense of everything else, the programs fail, the money sits and is unused or unusable because it can't get connected to all the pieces and parts, and Daphany just said it. When people are forced to Frankenstein all these funding sources together because nobody's thinking holistically, it creates the administrative burden, which then keeps us from getting the thing done. So that's something we really try to do as an agency, is like do the things we're doing in a really careful way so that our outcomes are where we need them to be, not just where we want them to be.
That's great, thank you. And we have talked about the looking ahead, ways of finding a result. I'd like to jump to Ingrid to ask, how should we be measuring success when it comes to access and opportunity in housing?
Great question. I love thinking about measurement. I will say it's not an easy answer. I would say that I think we should move beyond what past administrations have done, which is basically kind of counting units built and sort of a very simple count of building of units. And that's not to say that's not important to track, but I really would love to see us shift more towards focusing more on people. Rather, this is sort of, I think, the sometimes housing policy. I think you sort of said this, Daphany, too. That housing policy folks, we think too much about bricks and mortar, and we think about counting homes and buildings, and we really need to focus on people. So we should not be counting a unit as being affordable unit as being completed if it's not occupied and it sits empty for 6 months. We should be thinking about number of people housed, not just number of units. So I think we really want to sort of move away from this and really focus more, take the perspective more of people. I think number two, I think we want to pay a lot more attention to process. I think come up with different metrics. And I know at HPD you're thinking about this, Jennifer, but I think that thinking about things like tracking and really pushing on what's the delay to get people housed, how long is an available unit sitting vacant, how long does it take for agencies to respond to permit requests? And third, I think we need to think about neighborhoods. And again, think about, a housing plan is not going to be successful if all the new homes are built in a few particular neighborhoods. We really have to, I think an effective, a successful housing plan that really, enhances opportunity and equity and sustainability really has to be one where every neighborhood in the city is participating.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys for your participation. We have a couple questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. You can grab mine.
Hi, thanks. Ingrid, I was curious what your thoughts were about the PACT program and how you measure its success, or if you have thoughts about its success thus far.
Like I said, unfortunately, I don't think we have a lot of good alternatives. I do think that the PACT, the process that I sort of was closest to, the Furman Center sat on the advisor, whatever I forget what it was called, but basically the group that met together on a weekly basis for about a year or maybe at Chelsea Elliott and Chelsea. So I think that's sort of, getting input, allowing for choice among residents. But I do think that the surveys of residents, we need to continue to look at this, suggest quite, fairly high levels of satisfaction. We did one early research project which suggested some benefits that some of the residents actually saw, health benefits, or on average there were sort of improvements in overall health and disease burden. And thirdly, we haven't seen any increases in evictions or displacement, again, on average, but I think we do need to be sort of tracking this and monitoring it. But I do think that it is, again, the alternative is just that so many public housing buildings are just in such horrendous shape that we need to bring more capital in. And the section, moving from Section 9 to Section 8, sorry, this is a little wonky, but it still provides a lot of tenant protections and affordability, and then allows those developments to access both private and public sources of capital for much needed investment.
Hi, thank you. As a passive house developer, can you speak to the practicality of passive house as a deliverable for local law 97 and the issues you talked about?
I can take that. It's a complex question. Anything with local law 97 is complicated. But passive house, well, it's true, right? I mean, nobody's walking around saying, "Oh, sure, we got that, we nailed that one." But for passive house, right, what we're seeing at least at HPD and across regulated affordable housing is that passive house for new construction is getting easier and easier to build, right? As now all buildings are electric, right? And the energy code is getting more rigorous. Energy recovery ventilation is right? Becoming more and more mandatory under the new energy code. And it's a great strategy because it doesn't just solve the local law 97 emissions problem, but it solves a whole lot of other problems as well on the new construction side. At least what we're seeing is it's a great strategy for retrofits too, but still hasn't become so cost constrained, right, that it's going to be the answer to solve all of the existing problems right now. It would be great if it did and could, but people are struggling just to get to the next 5 years of compliance in local law 97, and that's going to be a major challenge in my mind.
I was very impressed with all the panelists. And Daphany, I wanted to ask you something. You have a very attractive menu of where you can help individuals or people doing projects with lots of things in the process of buying something. How do people know where to find you or how to find you?
Thank you. You can reach out to us at info@kc3.nyc. We're more than happy to provide services. One thing that I didn't share earlier is that for us, it's critical, again, to make things accessible. So for people that are eligible for our programs, it's actually free. So we don't charge homeowners, tenants, or building owners. Oh, great question. So each program that we design with our community partners, they are sharing the information within the communities that they're working in. So for example, NHS of Queens shares it in Queens. UHAB works with our local HDFCs and Mitchell-Lamas. So that's how that information is shared. But if you're interested, info@kc3.nyc is our email, and we're more than happy to kind of connect you to the programs.